A key component of the Catholic understanding of God is the idea that God is perfectly simple. It's unsurprising, then, that many Catholics have put forward an argument for the existence of God that argues that something that's perfectly simple must exist, and that this thing must be God. So what does it mean for a thing to be perfectly simple? Well, to put it simply, it means that the thing isn't composite. It's not composite. So what does it mean for a thing to be composite? It means it's made out of parts. Take my chair, for example. My chair has legs, a back, a base. These are different parts of the chair. But none of these parts by itself is the chair. And it's not until all the parts are together that you get a chair. And you can't have a chair without these parts working together. My chair is a composite. It's something that's made up of parts. Or take me. I have arms, legs, a head, a brain, feet, toes. These are different parts of me. And without these parts working together, I don't exist. That's what it means for a thing to be composite. What this argument is trying to show is that there has to exist something which isn't like that. Something which isn't made out of parts, which is just one. It doesn't have any parts, so it's perfectly singular. How can we know that a thing like this exists? Well, it comes down to a question. What holds the parts of composite things together? Go back to my chair example. Remember, we said a chair doesn't exist unless its parts are held together. So this begs the question, what is it that holds the parts of the chair together? Well, maybe you say it's the chair itself which holds its parts together. But this doesn't really make sense. After all, if the chair doesn't exist unless its parts are held together, but the parts aren't held together unless the chair exists, but the chair doesn't exist unless its parts are held together, we get this circular explanation, which doesn't give us an explanation, a real explanation of how the chair exists right now, how its parts are held together right now. So that explanation doesn't really work. Well, maybe you could say instead that if it's not the chair which holds its parts together, it's some other composite thing. And this seems to have more going for it. After all, if I looked under my chair right now, I would see two little screws tying together the legs of my chair and the base of my chair. It seems that these screws, which are themselves made up of parts, are holding the parts of my chair together. But note that this can't be the ultimate explanation. Because if the screws are themselves made up of parts, and they are, then we can ask the same question about the screws that we did about the chair. What's holding the parts of the screws together? And if we say the screws are being held together by something that is itself made out of parts, then we can ask the same question about that something. And we can go back, and we get this regress of explanations that doesn't give us any substantial explanation for how the chair or the screws or anything else exists right now. So we need to appeal to another option. And the only thing we have left is to say that it's something not composite that is holding composite things together. And this works because a not composite thing, because it's not composite, because it doesn't have any parts, you don't have to say that there's something holding its parts together because it doesn't have any parts that need to be held together. It just exists. But what gets really interesting is when we start thinking about what this thing would have to look like. And notice I said this thing, because in principle, there could only ever be one of these perfectly simple things. And that's because the way we differentiate two different things is we say there's some part of one thing that another thing doesn't have. So in order to have two different partless things, we would have to have one partless thing over here and another partless thing over here, and this partless thing has some part that this other partless thing doesn't have. But if this one partless thing has parts, then it's not really a partless thing. So you could only ever have one perfectly simple thing, one thing which doesn't have parts. But that means that it's the same perfectly simple thing which holds together all composite things. Everything other than itself, this perfectly simple thing holds together. That means that this thing is the cause of everything that is. It also must be immaterial, because matter is necessarily composite. If you take any sized clump of matter, no matter how big, you can always cut it up into even smaller sections. Matter will always be made up of parts. So if something doesn't have parts, it can't be made up of matter. It also can't change, because to change is to gain one part or lose one part. And this thing doesn't have any parts to gain or lose. That means it also must be timeless, because time is a measure of change. So far, we've said that there must exist something, one perfectly simple thing, which is the timeless, immaterial, changeless cause of all that is. But we can say more than that, because this thing also couldn't lack anything. Because what it means to lack something is to not have some part. And this thing, as a thing that doesn't have any parts, couldn't have some part that it doesn't have. So, if it can't lack anything, every kind of perfection this thing has in completion. These would include things like goodness, power, knowledge, wisdom, and being. So there must exist, therefore, a perfectly simple, immaterial, timeless, changeless cause of all that is, which is also all good, all-knowing, all-powerful, all-wise, and infinite being itself. And that thing is God.